All right, as you guys are gathering yourselves and getting settled in for lunch, we're going to start our lunch presentation. And appropriately, it is about North American traditional Indigenous food systems. Today, we actually are enjoying buffalo stew, and that's about as Indigenous as we could get using the vendors, required vendors from the hotel. And I'm thankful that they had that on the menu. Today's presenter is Rob Kineen. He is the Outreach Director for NATIFS and is of Tlingit heritage from Alaska. He resides in Durham, North Carolina currently. As a trained chef, his interest with traditional foods led to video webisode series, a cookbook, Cooking for Notable Personalities. Rob engages with community across the country and beyond to grow education and accessibility of traditional foods. So let's welcome Rob to the stage.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's been amazing to hear so much knowledge and so much care about the land, the traditional lands that we're on. So for that, I'm appreciative. So North American traditional Indigenous food systems, again, education and awareness of traditional foods and knowledge are our objectives. So next slide. So again, I was born in Petersburg in Southeast Alaska. I'm of Tlingit heritage. My family's from Sitka for the most part. And growing up, I was sort of removed from my culture. And I never really thought too much about the sense of being traditional and a chef. This was at one point where I was doing a film release in the 90s at the National Museum of American Indian. And the film release was called For the Rights of All. It was about the civil rights or the Indigenous civil rights movement in Alaska that actually predates the national movement by 20 years. Next slide. Another exhibit that I saw was this one. It was called Skating on the Res. And it was a gentleman named Jim Murphy, who's Indigenous American, and he used to skate with the Alva Brigade in the early 80s. So he eventually started learning about his heritage and started putting positive Native messaging on skateboards. And I think when you start thinking about the culture of skating, what he would do is he'd go to powwows and he'd kind of talk about positive messaging on skateboards with youth that were kind of in that dangerous zone of 12 to 14, where they were too young to stay home, but, you know, kind of maybe disinterested in being with the family. So he, you know, kind of started not only pressing activities, but you think like, hey, you're going to do this a lot better sober than on something. And you're going to, you know, take care of yourself and respect authorities and things like that. So for me, again, this is where I started really kind of coming into a thought process that I was sort of raised away from my culture, but through my actions and through my profession as a chef, you know, we're the first people that get called for a community fundraiser. We're the first people to give back in our communities. And I realized that I have a lot of Native traditional values that I hold close to me as a person and as a professional. So it was kind of a big moment for me. Next slide. And in 2014, I actually got to bring Jim Murphy to Alaska with the Alaska Native, or with the Alaska Anchorage Museum. So he's with the Stronghold Society as his nonprofit, and we actually decoupaged skateboards, worked with youth, Indigenous youth, decoupaging skateboards. We had a half ramp there, and that was a really nice moment for me. Next slide. So this is, you know, again, like when you kind of start assessing, for me, this is evolutionary. So like, you know, the idea of like, what does Alaska have to promote its own culture, its own food culture? We've got 33,000 miles of coastline, which is more than the rest of the United States combined. We have many Indigenous cultures and rich traditional foods, unadulterated land with rich and forageable foods. Some of the negatives that we have are frontier food culture trying to replicate the lower 48. In-state infrastructure. So if you're foraging foods in, you know, in the interior, it's hard to get to the southeast or from southwest into, into somewhere else. Like it's very challenging. It's a food circle that has gaps in it. Next slide. Kind of putting that into perspective, and I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, I guess, but Alaska's got, it's got basically 6 different regions, a lot of different languages, a lot of different cultures within our state. So for me, that was kind of one of the hurdles that I looked at, in the sense of like, what is traditional Alaskan food? That means something very different in Southeast than it does in the interior and in the, the Arctic regions. So that was something that I was kind of looking at as well. Next slide. And again, if you take Alaska and you put it into the rest of the continental 48 states, it's actually spans coast to coast and almost top to bottom. If you were to take Alaska and cut it in half, Texas would be the 3rd largest state. So again, when you start looking at food culture and what it means with locations, there's vast areas to cover. Next slide. Some of the work I did, it's been, I've gotten a chance to again cook for a lot of different people. So I actually got to do a 6-course dinner for President Obama in 2015. He was up in Alaska, seeing firsthand the effects of climate change. And so he had been to Exit Glacier, where you can literally watch mile markers of, the 70s to the 80s, like watch real-time recession of a glacier. And then he had gone to other rural areas and seen, fish, some stuff with permaculture, some other things. So that was a really big highlight for me. Next slide. I also got to cook for Al Roker. So this was really exciting because I did a Alaska regional cuisine. And on this event, it was like, spot shrimp, fireweed tendrils, spruce tips, just talking about traditional foods that were very nuanced and, not again, the salmon and halibut and king crab are awesome, but traditional foods are a lot more than that. So to highlight, traditional foods in that respect was really fantastic. Next slide. One of the things I've done to kind of even just start kind of looking at the process of traditional foods. This is something I have in my cookbook. It's called 3 Sisters. So 3 Sisters are corns, beans, and squash, and corn culture pretty much across Turtle Island. You grow your corn, that gives structure for the beans to grow around the corn, and it provides shade for the squash. I'm not a biologist, but one needs potassium, one gives potassium, one needs nitrogen, the other one gives nitrogen. So basically, it's also nutritionally almost a complete diet. So if you add some dry fish or dried bison to that, you've got a nutritionally balanced meal. And then if it's a culture that's mobile, as they leave, this will go to seed. It basically drops down. It creates neutral environment. There's nothing depleted from the environment. Everything goes to seed. And that was kind of something I thought about working with traditional foods. I try not to use alcohol. I don't use alcohol. And there's an evolutionary process to that, again, with working with natives as well. But this was kind of a first example of some work that I was doing with that. And again, like, you don't think of corn, bean, and squash as traditional. You can get that in any grocery store across the country, but it is indigenous knowledge. Next slide. These are some examples of items that I was doing. This was in an award ceremony at the Alaskan, some event I was doing. Anyways, the mushrooms are actually seal stuffed, and they've got cranberries in them or sour cherries. And, the idea was that, you're eating something rich in irony, and then you've got something kind of like sweet and tart to kind of counteract that. The sushi roll is actually crab. It's got beach asparagus in it as well. So again, like, beach asparagus, king crab, seaweed, all those things actually provide a lot of nutritional elements, but they also, like the beach asparagus in there actually helps absorb that into your body. And then obviously spot shrimp, and that was on something a little more garden fresh. So locally grown cucumbers with a spring onion vinaigrette. And yeah, so that's kind of an example of working with traditional foods, I guess. Next slide. Again, the vast difference of areas. So I did some contract work in Tyonek, and if you're familiar with Anchorage, which is 300,000 people, you get on a Cessna 160 thing with 2 seats and a whole lot of luck. You go up and over Cook Inlet, drop down, and it's a 500-person village. So they wanted to start using fresh ingredients and realized that I was there to kind of help facilitate that with the youth. Next slide. So this is in contrast up in the Upiaq area. So this is close to Utagabe or in Utagabe. And took this picture. It was 40 degrees below zero. And this is called Palm Island. So the palm trees are actually just poles. And then on the top of that is baleen cut to make it look like that. So it's kind of funny because I'm taking these pictures and I have the gloves where you pull the mitten back. And it's, 35, 40 degrees below zero. So my fingers are turning red and cold as I'm taking pictures. And it's just, the diversity is amazing. I was up there for the week of healthy living in January. So what you see in the back with the sun, that was also, had just come up. So like from November 21st to January 21st, the days are like our sunsets, basically. You don't actually physically, or you don't see the sun. So again, like in these extreme environments, I think if you listen to your food, you'll actually be successful. Next slide. This was the premier time when I was up there for the week of healthy living. So again, seaweed doesn't grow that far north, but I've got nori, not local vegetables, but I have vegetables. Sprouts were sprouted with the University of Alaska Fairbanks program there. And then I have muktuk as well. So next slide. And that was everything I filled in. And then the actual dish I did, and I kind of bumped it up with a little extra muktuk. And again, when you have that extreme environment with no sun or no daylight, no sunlight for months, omega-3 fatty acids, which translate into vitamin D, are available with muktuk and salmon, but specifically muktuk, which is whale fat. So again, working with your environment, embracing your environment, it actually does take care of you no matter how extreme it might be. Next slide. In contrast, these are not traditional vegetables, but this is in Sitka. So that's Mount Edgecombe in the back, right off the Sitka Sound there. And just a temperament climate. And again, like for me, my family's from Sitka. So I actually got to go to Totem Park and I brought my daughter there. And it was just fascinating to sit there and you're watching salmon go up the Indian Creek and there's berries and there's birds and eggs and shrimp and seaweed. And it's just like, I would never leave here either. Like, it's just so bountiful and amazing. There's seal in there. It's just, anything you could want and need pretty much is right there. So it's really interesting, again, to see so much diversity in the landscape, and that folds into traditions and food availability. Next slide. These are two samples of dishes that I was doing. These were both in Sitka. The further one is actually a salmon soup. So that was, I did that for an elders program. So traditionally, it was kind of a take on fish head soup. There's no fish heads in there, but I cooked the salmon down, made a broth, potatoes. I added some vegetables. There's beach asparagus in there, dried seaweed on the top of the slide. And then on the bottom is seal oil. So it's a very traditional dish. Again, you've got the nutritional benefits of salmon. You've got the nori, which has got a lot of trace minerals and vitamins that actually take all the omega fatty 3 acids out of the salmon and into your body. You've got the seal oil as well, and the beach asparagus. And then on the other side, this was done with a school program, farm to school, fish to school. And so it was a piece of salmon. We actually broke down a salmon with high school students. We made this like a salsa. So with peppers, black beans, and vegetables, a little bit of beach asparagus to the side. And then I put that over brown rice. So again, no dairy, no gluten, no, pretty much all indigenous ingredients or farm fresh. Next slide. I actually got to do an officer's commissioning on the USS Anchorage. So that was kind of fun. I was born in a town with 3,000 people on it, and I think this boat had 8,000. And so I was also working in a kitchen that had, they had these double boil soup containers where you actually had to get up on a ladder and stir it because you're feeding all these people food. So it was kind of fascinating. But next slide. So growing up in Southeast, if you're familiar, if you're from there, you know, these are herring eggs, and you know, that's a delicacy. And this was kind of, for me, a really, I did a contract work for the Sitka Seafood Festival for 6 years, which is in Sitka. And one of the people that we started working with was Alaska Gold Caviar. So they were actually taking this herring roe and using it, or they were processing it, so it was available for purchase. But at the same time, it was kind of a good transition into the idea of how we can take traditional foods but actually modify it for markets. And kind of a fascinating thing for me with this trip too is I spent time in Sitka, and so again, like we had, you know, fresh rendered seal oil and in herring eggs. And then later that, like literally that week, I went up to Kotzebue, and this was in May. So I was up in Kotzebue in like late May, and the seawall broke and the herring started running. And I was watching, just, it was like midnight, and these like all these young families, people were out catching herring. And, you know, it's like, hey, what are you guys doing with that? And like, oh, we just save it for bait, or maybe we'll cook it, or, you know, we save the eggs for this or that. And so it's just kind of funny how in one area, herring eggs could be such a delicacy and such an item. And then in the other one, it's kind of like a item. And then we also had seal oil, and it was canned with tundra herbs. And then later that year, I was at the state fair, and I was working with seal oil that was black meat, which was, you basically ferment the oil. So it, as the meat tightens, it releases the oil, and it's fermented in a kind of a cold press. And that was, it was just kind of fascinating to see all the diversity of the same item, like a seal oil, but done in 3 different ways. And, you know, and herring roe kind of taken in 2 or 3 different contexts there as well. So next slide. This was something I did kind of, again, promoting, you know, for me, it's like Alaska regional cuisine. So I had a value-added sauce line. So that was actually the cocktail sauce in there. And then that's an Alaskan scallop, Alaskan king crab, herring roe, Alaska pure sea salt. So again, like alder smoked salt. So a uniquely flavored Alaskan ingredient made with not salt that came up from Oregon that was hot smoked, but it was actually Sitka Sound seawater reduced down, and it makes this beautiful product. And then seasoned with alder. And then again, like microgreens, and microgreens are obviously not traditional, but it's a good way to get, like, let's say it's a 7-day process from seed to sprout. So you're giving something that's got a nutritional bounce, a nutritional blast of energy for you right there. And so if you think about like a head of lettuce growing, something like that is a good way to get fresh items to market in rural areas. Next slide. This is bouncing around a little bit, but this is going back to Tyonek. This is with the Tribal Conservation District. And so if you look at this, the big culvert on the back was where they were just building a salmon run. So basically in Tyonek, there was in the 60s or 70s, they built a road, and the road went over these 2 little culverts, which I want to say are like 6 or 8 feet. I guess that's 6 feet. So, they're small. And if you look at the water level in there, that was actually where the salmon were supposed to run to go back upstream to spawn. Well, the salmon couldn't get through that across a road. Every few years, the road would wash out. So what they did is they put in a 36-foot culvert, which is over on that side. And they put it about 1/3 into the water to replicate the actual stream, not only width, but depth, so that salmon could actually get up that stream. So that was a great way to kind of like, you know, again, with just kind of work with the surroundings and kind of make this work where the actual salmon did come back and back to spawn now. So next slide. And again, in Tyonek, I got a chance to work with the community and youth, and this was a USDA process. So the neat part is like, it's, you know, they're growing fresh vegetables. They've got potato patches. And then in here, they actually have squash. They have, the funny thing, they're actually growing tobacco, and it's not to smoke or anything, but it's actually, they put it at the edge of the greenhouse because it's kind of like a natural Velcro for aphids. So aphids come in, they land on that, and you just see them stuck to the tobacco. And then in the back, you saw corn. And actually, I made a luncheon for them, for the community, to celebrate all the food. And they had watermelon as well. And I thought that was kind of funny, but they're like, hey, you know, the youth are planting these seeds. We're asking them what they want to grow. And so we're encouraging that by, you know, even if it doesn't work out. So the funny part was like the first year I went there were like maybe 3 ears of corn. But the last year I went there, they had like almost the whole back end of the greenhouse was full of corn. They had figured out how to make it work. So that was really, really neat. And then the other thing that was kind of cool about this was that they were looking at an irrigation system, and they're like, well, if we used a generator, diesel gas is going to cost how much over 20 years. So even though it was a little more front forward financing, they put up a solar panel generator. So it's like basically solar panel, and with routine maintenance, I think it's every 5 years to upkeep that, they could actually run their generator on solar power. And I thought that was really a neat idea for, especially for remote areas. Next slide. This is the dish I made with all the local ingredients from Tyonek. So, tomatoes. The only thing that wasn't local was salt, pepper, and oil. So there's some foraged items in there, and then kind of like almost a slaw with the vegetables, the local salmon, and kind of a nice sauce. Next slide. The one thing for me that I keep thinking about, like over this time too, though, was that, while it was great that there was local food in Tyonek, it was also based on like, 2x4s, bisqueen, and seeds. And when you land in Tyonek and you go to the beach, like these are beach peas. So like literally, next slide, you open them up and they're fresh peas. And this is more in the, like I think in July, but if you go there in May and June, you've got tendrils and you've got sprouts and blossoms and things like that. So there's a lot of local indigenous stuff right there. You land on the airstrip and you see a field of fireweed and you see spruce tips and you see all these edible botanicals. And for me, it's that comprehension that also that is of value. And that is, something that we should be paying attention to as well. Next slide. Again, another, in Southeast, I definitely had many a run in with Devil's Clubs, but, in the spring, there's the blossoms and shoots off the Devil's Club. And in the fall, it's medicine with the root. Next slide. Fireweed tendrils again. And I'll talk about this in just a second as well. But again, just something, 2-week harvest window. And then actually as it grows up into the fall, you've got the blossoms and you can make jellies and jams and sweet things with that. Next slide. Again, kind of going back to the diversity of the state. I actually got to go to Bethel a few times, but this was one in particular. Next slide. Going to the Bethel Farmers Market. So again, this isn't traditional foods, but it was harvesting foods in a way where he's actually exporting produce from Bethel, Tim Myers. So he's got, right here, the kind of neat part is these greenhouses, they're cold climate. So, in May, when it's 40 degrees out, he's got the beds of row. He's got a felt kind of over the seed. And then he's got those little hoop houses, and they might even be double layers. So if it's like the gauze over the thing, it's like 10 degrees, so now it's 50. You've got another thing, it's 60, another layer, it's 70. So he's actually manipulating his environment to grow produce. And he actually also uses, whether it be salmon or fish byproducts when he's, from fishing, he grinds it up and folds it into his soil as well, which is already nutrient dense because it's the old YK. It was a glacial system. So the mineral count in this area is very, very steep. Next slide. And then, again, this is, I usually talk to people that aren't familiar with Alaska. So I talk about this being the Yukon-Kuskokwim. And I actually did so you fly into Bethel, and I can't think of what village it was, but I got on a Cessna and I went to this, little village, and the contract never it finished, but I really wanted to go in the winter and drive the YK. So that's actually becomes an ice highway. Next slide. And again, like some of the variants, not only of the diversity of the area, but one of the things I'm kind of keep thinking about is how we are doing work and overcoming obstacles within with our traditional foods. So I actually just got to cook for the Manilac Association in Portland last month at a board retreat, but this was something that was really exciting for me. So next slide. This is a USDA approved facility. It's called the Sigliac. I'm sure I'm not saying that correctly, so I apologize. Next slide. So it's a Alaska Food Code established permit. So it's USDA approved. Next slide. And so here, if you're fishing and you need 3 she fish, but you get 4, you can bring them in and donate them to the community. So that's what's the fish off to the side there. And then on the other side is actually donated moose burger. So again, it's 5 pounds. The data was harvested. And then the lot number on the bottom is the recall. So if something happens, like they have a network that they can know who, where it came from, and then who has it in their freezer, or who's been eating it. But I just think that this, for me, is something that we should be looking at and not only celebrating, but talking about. So for me, this is kind of, where I was in Alaska at the time, but some of the work I do as an outreach director is kind of embracing this, holding it up. And I'm actually hoping to talk with the Mini-Lac Association about not only how they do this, but then also the protocols and the obstacles that they've had to overcome with maybe local government or state government. So this is really exciting. Next slide. Hello? So this was, for me, one of the eye-opening opportunities was to do a cooking demonstration at this event. And next slide. And this is something that it was overwhelming to kind of walk in and understand this. And I'm from Southeast. It's sort of funny because when I say I lived in Nome with my family, it's actually the Irish side of my family. But I have had these experiences of living rural and understanding I can be empathetic on both sides. If I own a store and I bring produce in, and it doesn't sell, then you're taking a loss. Whereas these are shelf-stable items. But I think we have to look at the nutritional capacity of these items as well, and maybe how overwhelming our systems with this and the damage we could be doing to ourselves. Next slide. So this was, so I was cooking with traditional food, or I was cooking with fast frozen IQF seafood. But for me, it was looking at this and realizing this is when you walk into a store in rural areas, this is 95% of what you see, if not 100%. And again, I think that these are built to be snack items, not necessarily things to subsist on. So that was eye-opening for me to kind of see that. Next slide. So about 6 years ago, I left Alaska and I moved down to North Carolina. And I was kind of working at that point. I realized that working with traditional foods is probably going to be more of a passion than a career. I was doing occasional traditional foods work in Alaska once or twice a year. So I'd go back and I was working with the Western Governors Association. So I was doing some work in Alaska, Washington, Oregon, California. And when you start thinking about seasonality, spirituality, and locality of traditional foods, those are vastly different landscapes. And that means vastly different things in all of those areas. So I actually reached out to NATIFS to ask about a collaborative effort. And that sort of turned into a job opportunity. So with this, I work with a gentleman named Sean Sherman. He goes by the Sioux Chef, S-I-O-U-X. He's Lakota Sioux from Pine Ridge Reservation. He lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota now. And they have, he started in about 2010 with a food truck, which turned into a catering company, which turned into a restaurant, and then this nonprofit that I work with him on. And the whole context is, again, education of traditional foods and accessibility to traditional foods. So we, when we work with Indigenous foods, we don't use beef, pork, or chicken. We don't use flour. We don't use dairy. We don't use refined sugars. And, you might kind of look around and say, well, what's left? And actually, there's amazing opportunities with what's left, whether it be fish, lake fish, sea fish, fruits, vegetables, alternative milks. And so it's actually been really eye-opening to kind of be a part of this. And one thing that's kind of crazy, I was eating at Awamni, and for dessert, it's just an example, but they have a wild rice sorbet. So they take wild rice and they steep it in hemp milk and sweeten it with agave. They take it, pulverize it, strain it, and then freeze it, aerate it. So when you have it, you're eating it with wajape, which is a choke cherry sauce that's seasoned with maple and sumac. So you're getting a sweet sour sauce. You smell something that smells familiar, but it's usually warm and aromatic, and it's cold and sweet, but it's still familiar. and then they put puffed wild rice over the top. So it's a popped flavor. So it's kind of taking the whole notion of wild rice and this flavor profile and kind of turning it on its side and offering something as a dessert, which is just amazing and exciting. So again, like even with these limitations that we're talking about, it's actually kind of looking and reprocessing and refocusing on the foods that we have and revaluing those foods that we have, which is really exciting. So next slide. And this is, so under the NATIFS, North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems, the working model under that is called Indigenous Food Lab. So as outreach director, part of my job is going to, like I got back from Eugene, Oregon last 2 weeks ago, and I was cooking. I did cooking demonstrations at NASU, which is Native American Student Union clubs in high schools. And then I did a feast at the Longhouse with all traditional foods at Lane Community College. And then on the flip side of that, the other half of my job is actually spurring these Indigenous Food Lab concepts. We're calling them extensions because it's sort of a model profile, but it's not, for example, like a Chipotle where we're doing the same menu and the same item everywhere. When we do this, the Food Lab, the flagship is in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We're working right now in South Dakota, Montana, Alaska, a little bit in California. And each one of those places will have a food lab, but the food in those labs will be, absolutely unique to the area and to the traditions and to the availability of the Indigenous people. So kind of along those lines, like phase 1, an urban location, phase 2, an Indigenous nonprofit restaurant. That's something that's exciting. We just opened up at the Food Lab in Minneapolis. It was a food production kitchen. And we finished it with, we just expanded. So we have like a media lab or a media center. We have a spirit kitchen. So let's say you want to start a food truck or a catering company with Indigenous intent. You can come and actually work and get real-time feedback, cost out recipes, get some trial and error conversations going on with staff there. We've got a retail space, and then we've got kind of a fast casual concept. So, we've got a pozole. We make tortillas from scratch there, tacos, arepas, and things like that. And then we've got a tea bar. So it's really exciting to kind of go in and just see, like, and same thing like going to a Wamni, and you're having like I'm alcohol free. So I'll have like a aronia berry and Labrador tea mocktail. And you're just kind of like, this is mind bending to kind of have something that I think about my grandparents' house in Alaska, and I'm drinking this like bougie little drink in a restaurant on the Mississippi River. So it's really exciting to kind of have all these things come together and see the possibilities and opportunities. Working with tribal communities to help develop satellite Indigenous kitchens. And again, something like this, again, for Alaska, I think that the vastness of the state, the base will be in Anchorage, but it needs to have extensions or tethers out to around the state, because I think there's much more to Alaska than Anchorage. And I think all of that's got to be valued. Make Indigenous foods accessible to areas that need it most. And that's, kind of that speaks for itself. Replicate Indigenous food lab centers which creates regional counterpoints for development for Indigenous food access and education. So again, working on curriculum outlines. What we want to do is, like, if we come into an area, we want to figure out what is needed and rise everybody up. We don't want to come in over the top and dictate what's going on. That's imperative for our work. And then develop tribal community Indigenous kitchens everywhere. So, which is, again, it's a lot of work to be done. So next slide. This is again, it's almost it's pretty fun, but that's Sean Sherman on the far slide at a Wamni, and Sean was just deemed one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time Magazine. So pretty exciting for a res kid from South Dakota. And then on the other side is it's actually open now, so that's even more exciting. So we'll have to update those pictures, but that's the Indigenous Food Lab. Next slide. So some of the opportunities I got to do, I was actually in Iceland last year at the Arctic Circle convention. And the lady was Sheila Flaherty and Runar Pierre. Runar Pierre runs a Michelin star restaurant. He's African-American and Icelandic, and Sheila is from Canada. She's Indigenous. So she's actually working on a really rad concept in Northern Canada, where she's going to have indigenous foods at basically a bed and breakfast type area, like in rural Canada. And it's due to a treaty that it's an anomaly that can happen. And then on the other side was sort of, for me, it's again, those flavors that you should, this was exciting for me because in Iceland, the opportunities for, in the circumpolar regions were just a little more liberal. So like sugar kelp, smoked dulse, which was amazing. Like Icelandic clams. And then the white kind of stuff shaved over there is dried halibut, lovage and yarrow. So again, I've never seen it where you can actually, purchase it. And then there's another, it's called sea truffle. But I basically just brought water to a boil, dropped all this stuff into a pot, dropped the clams in there. And it was just like this bomb of flavor because you've got dried halibut, smoked dulse, so you've got smoky, sweet, saline, and then the tundra herbs. It was just, beautiful. And again, like to me, that's what indigenous food should taste like. That's what it would be, so it's like, where would we be today if there wasn't the interruption of this colonialization? So next slide. One of the things, again, like when I start talking about the ideas of celebrating traditional foods, just because it's traditional doesn't mean it has to be old. So this is called, this is Labrador tea. It's in the Space Lab in Anchorage, Alaska. A friend of mine, she runs the Alaska Native Medical Center as the chef. And so if Rob Kineen, city native, gets hit by a bus, I go to the hospital and I want chicken soup and a sandwich, right? So, but if Rob Kineen, indigenous hunter, is up somewhere and he shoots himself in the foot and he gets medevac down, I want seal soup and salmon burgers or something. So through a donation process, she can actually serve all of that, which again is something that I want to kind of not only figure out. She did it through the USDA verbiage on the farm bill. So all she did was work with the verbiage from the USDA and with their dialogue, showed them how she can use, moose from a roadkill system and serve it to patients at the hospital. One thing she thinks about is stewardship. She doesn't want donations, even though they're growing every year, to hurt the environment or hurt people that are depending on it. So with the Space Lab, this is called aeroponics. And I just cook stuff for a living, so I don't really know what that is. But it's between the seeds, an aeroponic, which is a nutrient spray, and then the light colors, they're growing Labrador tea. Another thing they're growing is actually fireweed in this environment too. So the kind of neat part about that is that every 2 weeks they have fireweeds, Indian asparagus or fireweed, asparagus. And then they can also let them grow and make jams and jellies and things. But for the patients at the ANMC, they can have that year round. And then they're not also hurting the environment or taking something away from over harvesting on a subsistence or donation level as well. So these are things for me that I look at as, I don't know, there's a lot of stuff to complain about and I'm all about that. But then the next step is like, what are we going to do about it? And this is, to me, I look at it as a solution to an opportunity or a deficit. So next slide. And then I'm actually working with the USDA Food Distribution Program for Indian Reservations. So we just got done filming for the Northeast, the food box and a foraged item in each box. And I'll be doing that in Southeast in North Carolina at the end of the month. And this is a friend of mine now. We're BFFs actually now. Vicky Jeffries, and she is Okinichi Saponi. And we met in 2020 because I have an ink stitching on my arm here, and I'm supporting my Indigenous sisters, my Inupiaq sisters, but I'm Tlingit, so it's not traditional. But I met her, and I was like, "Hey, can I ask you about this chin tattoo?" And she's just kind of took a breath and kind of just started explaining. I'm like, "I'm asking because I'm Alaska Native, and I have some friends that actually started kind of working with this. So they're doing ink stitching, and a friend of mine, Holly Nordlum, started doing this, and mine was done by Sarah Leyland. But my point is that 300 years ago, I never would have met this woman, and they're in North Carolina. And if you look at her arms, I mean, it's just kind of fascinating to me that they have the tabalin and the marking, the traditional markings on her forearm there on the other picture. And I just realized, like, those are the things for me where I realize, like, we're just a little more connected than we think, because I immediately think of circumpolar when I see this work. And yet this is a whole big story of culture for her in the American, like, Southeast on Turtle Island. So next slide. And again, like some of the work we do with Indigenous foods, this was, I have a display out on my table out here, but It's the lake trout and leek soup. So these we went from an indigenous food kitchen to a food relief kitchen in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The lease was signed in January of 2020, and it finished. And then in March, COVID happened, and 6 weeks later, the George Floyd murder happened 6 blocks away from the food lab. So they started doing food relief, and they made 11 or 12 different soups, and they started, they actually produced this book to kind of just reflect on that. And then next to that is a garnish from Menominee, Wisconsin. So we used botanicals and different herbs and flowers, some foraged, some from the gardens. And it was just kind of a pretty picture. Next picture. Next slide. And finishing this up again, I'm Clinkett from Southeast, and I got a chance to go to Sitka as an adult, which was really exciting for me and soul filling. But this is Katlian. So this is the Clinkett war helmet of Katlian. And he was a Clinkett war chief. So in 1799, the Russian fur traders infiltrated Southeast, and they actually fended them off. In 1803, the Russians came back and they defeated the Clinkett. And for me, it's the resilience and the fortitude of the indigenous people that kept the faith for them until Alaska became territory of the United States of America in 1859, I believe. So for those like 50 plus years, there was a lot of trauma, a lot of turmoil, but there was also a lot of faith and astuteness as to who we are as people. And I like to reflect on that. Next picture. And again, so some of the work I got to do, there's a video webisode series called Traditional Foods Contemporary Chef. And I got to do a lot of work, but one of the things I got to do was actually go seal hunting and whale hunting in Stebbins and Alukkanuk on the Seward Peninsula within the Bering Sea. So we were there as an intervention. We were there to kind of take care of people and show people how to eat traditional foods. And for me, it was just really striking. Like, there's a lot of hardships in Indian country, but just because there are hardships doesn't mean everything is broken. And I was really taken by the community, just the way people kind of banded together. You're out on the Bering Sea on a boat, and you have the person you're with like one boat over, and then one CB call, and there's like 20 boats and 50 guys all processing food, to kind of take care of themselves and their community and each other. And again, it was just really, really fantastic. So next slide. And again, we're a young nonprofit. I know we're looking for an education team, an executive director actually as well. A lot of jobs that are based out of Minnesota. I put something on the Whova app as well. So a little bit about myself and about NATIFS and some of the work we're doing. If you want to check it out, www.natifs.org. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much. Rob Kineen has a booth out here in the hallway. So if there are any follow-up discussions that you would like to have with Rob, he will be out there. And I apologize, Rob, for rushing you. I know you were talking super fast to try to get through all of that. So thank you for accommodating our time.